They hired me because I kept showing up. I say that in the dry way you say things you don't expect to be heroic. I show up at midnight at a service entrance 2 miles from the closest highway, past a line of dead pines and the kind of wind that chews through boots. I clock in, I wheel out the mop bucket, I follow the checklist in the leather rulebook tucked under my jacket. Nobody at the facility ever told me I was important. Nobody had to. The rules told me instead. The rulebook is small and heavy, the kind of thing that smells like oil and old ink. I carry it in a coat pocket. On the inside cover, there's a faded stamp. Site Alpha, Secure Operations. The paper has been replaced once. The binding is repaired with electrical tape. Someone, somewhere, has written Rule 0 in thick black marker on the front page and underlined it. Rule 0 doesn't let you forget you work inside a place that divides what it's allowed to know and what it needs to hide. Rule 0. This facility exists to isolate and study anomalies. Compliance is safety. Rule 4. On announcement of green status, proceed to the nearest designated safe room and enact lockdown. Rule 17. Do not engage entities that mimic human behavior. Observe, report. Do not trust mimicry. Those are the short ones I read most nights. Scattered between them are smaller instructions, practical as bandages. Times for the main service elevator, ventilation filter checks, the names of janitorial closets that never change. There are margins where someone has written notes in pencil, dates, initials, a single phone number crossed out. Once, 6 months in, when I sat alone by the service door with a thermos and frost on my beard, I found a folded scrap stitched into the seam. It had someone else's handwriting. Dr. Susan Vox. Her words were 3 lines, almost a joke. If you find this, don't be kind to shadows. Keep the book tight. The first weeks I treated the place like any other job. There was the stink of solvent, a hum of fluorescent lights. There were the same fluorescent jokes about the night shift and Eliza, the receptionist, who'd leave a coffee cup by the back door and a smile for the cameras. I learned where the hidden flush valves were, which mop heads to use for lab tiles, and how to neutralize the automatic soap dispensers in the West Wing when they decided to spray like an old sprinkler. I learned to move without making noise, because the people I worked around, people like Dr. Emerson, who ran orientation, talked in quiet and wore the soft step jackets of people who thought 3 degrees to the right of normal was where the work lived. Dr. Emerson was the kind of man who spoke in small, precise sentences. He introduced himself with a hand that was warm and firm, and then handed me a badge the size of a coin. "It's tracking and authentication," he said. "Don't worry about how. Just wear it on the jacket. The book is more important than the tech. It tells you when to move." He tapped the leather cover and smiled like someone who knew a joke he hadn't been allowed to tell. He taught me 2 gestures. 1, to slide the badge over the card reader. 2, the pause you take before opening any door labeled with a red triangle. "Respect the triangles," he said. "Respect the colors." He told me not to look at certain monitors in the maintenance bay. He told me to never, ever pry the freezer seals in Cryolab B. He told me why, in a calm voice that made the warning scarier than anything his worry could have been. You pick up small rituals when your life consists mostly of empty corridors and fluorescent hums. I learned to lock myself into the green rooms and wait. I learned to listen for a tapping pattern the facility used as a check-in, staccato, 3 taps, then a pause, and to answer with the same pattern if the intercom asked. I learned which vents sounded wrong when the bearings were going, and which ones were holding secret things inside. I learned the badge buzzes you get used to, amber for routine, green for authenticated, and the night everything started, blue. When you stand in a service hallway at 2 in the morning with a mop bucket at your heels and blue light spilling down the walls, you have a lot of time to think and very little company. I spent 6 months doing that. I grew used to the routine enough that it felt like armor. The leather felt like armor. The badge felt like a small warm coin against the bone of my chest. You cannot know how steady a human can become until you've seen them make repetition into a defense. The day it started, the intercom said my full name. It didn't say Nash. It didn't say Janitor 11. It said my full name, with the kind of clarity that could only come as someone had time to pronounce it like a bell. "James E. Nash," the voice said, soft and then layered, like a speaker placed inside a cave. "Rule 4, green room immediate." There was the kind of stuck calm that comes before you move because there is no other option. People think panic looks like running. Panic is often the opposite, A small rationality peels the panic like skin and reveals something just plain and mechanical that says, "Follow procedure." I slid into the closest safe room, the one marked with a faded green square on the bulkhead. Rule 4 told me to lock and block the door, to seal the vents, and to cut power except to essential systems. I did it. I hooked a metal bar across the inner latch and jammed a mop handle against it for redundancy. I felt ridiculous, and somehow exactly where I needed to be. The intercom tapped again, the 3 staccato verification. The voice sang out the clearance code. I answered with the tapping pattern, because that's how we did it. There was a taste in the back of my mouth like metal. The vents were breathing. I could hear the building think. Then there was something under the door. At first, I thought it was water.
The bottom of the door had a neat line of frost, like someone had exhaled against the world. Something slid, a wet, glinting thing, and a finger of ice pushed under the crack. It was small, a tendril, and it felt inappropriate to the geometry of the rest of the world. It seemed to know the doorways like a hand knows a familiar face. Rules tell you how to behave. They also tell you what not to do. Rule 17, sometimes in a margin with the pencil scrawl: do not open for mimicry. Do not reply to mimicry. Do not trust voice-only identification. The thing under the door pressed and curled like a tongue tasting the air. It left a slick trail on the metal threshold, clear and cold. I could feel it through the sole of my boot, the cold concrete sucking heat like a slow theft. For a breath, the facility felt far larger and somehow more intimate than before, like being inside someone's chest. Then it spoke. It used a voice that had accents stitched into it. At first, it used Dr. Emerson's cadence, soft, but underneath there were edges that didn't belong, elongated vowels, a little delay between words, as if there were too many layers to a single mouth. It called the rule-scribed words. "James Nash, we can help. It's cold out here." I thought of the seam-wound note in the rulebook. I thought of Dr. Emerson's warm hand. I thought of the green bar across my door. I did what I'd always been taught. I didn't open the hatch. I kept my palm pressed to the mop handle that braced the door. The voice under the door changed its rhythm, tried on an old joke I had only heard once, Dr. Emerson's small laugh that he kept too high and too short. The tendril retracted, then pushed again. The intercom clicked. The head of the building announced, "Green room breach protocol activated." The blue little beacon on my badge, until then an amber purr, flared. Badges are more than metal and ship. They're more than a name. Mine was quantum tagged, a coin, like Dr. Emerson said, tied into a tracking lattice. It had been calibrated to buzz and glow and give orders 1,000 quiet ways. I watched the coin go from amber to a cold electric blue. When your ID turns blue, you stop pretending this is part of a late-night drill. I could hear people moving down the hall now, footfalls, the hollow thunk of something heavy being dragged. The call lights in the corridor winked blue through the vent grills, like a warning sent through snow. I braced the bar and started to listen, because that's the thing about being the kind of person who carries a mop into a facility like that. You get used to being the ears. I slid out of the safe room when the corridor cleared enough to make noise without risk. The building smelled like ozone and old antiseptic. Lights had gone to emergency dim, a blue that made everything seem as if the world had been painted underwater. I moved the mop bucket down the service corridor that led to the labs, keeping to shadows and trying to ignore the way my lungs felt like they were inhaling icicles. The labs looked like a storm had blown through them. Cabinets were yawned open, drawers emptied, a centrifuge lay on its side like a toppled lamp. Whatever had been here had been careful and then furious. There was an impression in the tile where something heavy and wrong had slid. The cryogenics room, the one door with the red triangle I had learned never to pry, was ajar. The seals were torn. Inside, frost clung to the edges like cobwebs, and the cryopods were empty. I stood in the doorway for a long time and stared. It felt obscene to be human in a room where such careful mechanical sleep had been upended. There was a smell, the sterile, acrid tang of liquid nitrogen, and something beneath it that I didn't have a name for. A wet smear blackened the floor where a frozen lifebelt had been dragged away. There were prints in the frost, not human. They were more like the marks left by something that had webbed feet and fingers, sometimes flat and wide, sometimes curling into concentric microsuction scars. They led toward the service stairwell. They led down, away from the labs. I did the smallest thing I could think to do. I ran. You don't run in the facility halls, because running is what you do when you confess there's a predator. But I ran in the way you run when there are only a few choices left, and you take the one that seems least likely to end in you being eaten. I followed the badge's faint directional hum. It pulsed like a heartbeat, and it told me to go to checkpoint Alpha.
Checkpoint Alpha is a small cabin wedged between maintenance and the back service road, lit inside by a single lamp and stocked with the sort of emergency rations no one ever wants to try. It has a fold-out chair with a tear in the vinyl, a radio canal that had a sticker, Site Alpha, emergency link, and a small window you can crank open in the summer to see the aurora. In winter, the window is a smear of salt and snow, and you don't open it. I got there breathing too hard and sweating into my jacket sleeve. I locked the door, and then, because the part of me that had learned to do things properly wouldn't be denied, I set the bar across the inside lock and jammed the mop handle under it again. I turned the radio on. The satellite line chirped and patched through with a static flecked voice. Containment breach, blue light, all personnel to nearest checkpoint. Do not engage, await extraction. It was a voice that sounded like a conference room full of men who had rehearsed the words. The radio gave me coordinates and a time and some reassurance, brittle as glass. Extraction to follow. Keep sealed. Await further instruction. I took a breath and dried my palms on my pants. My badge hummed against my breastbone. Blue was washing through the slot in the cabin door like a tide.
I sat in the folding chair and took my rulebook out of my jacket. The seam that held Dr. Vox's paper was warm under my fingers. I unfolded the note and read it again. The pencil had smudged where my glove had brushed it before, and the words were quieter than before. If you find this, don't be kind to shadows. Keep the book tight. The radio sputtered. There was a soft scratching at the cabin door. At first I thought it was wind, then the scratching became patient and precise. A knuckle rapped against the metal in a rhythm completely unlike the tapping pattern the facility used to check in. Slow, hesitant, then a cadence too short to be a rodent. The person on the other side started to speak in a voice that matched the cadence of Dr. Susan Vox. I had met her once, months earlier, in a hallway where she had too much hair and too many coffee rings on her lab coat. She had a laugh that ended like a question. I knew her voice well enough to hum it. "James," she said through the door. "It's Vox. Open up. Please." There were small things wrong with it, the way actors are wrong when they mimic someone. The vowel lengths were off. Her S's lingered. The consonants softened. There was a pause between syllables, as if the voice needed to reconstruct a memory to form the sentence. The key thing the rulebook taught was to watch for mimicry cues. A wrong laugh, a smile that takes too long, a gesture without the underlying muscle memory. She sounded human enough to make me consider my humanity. She sounded exactly like her. And then, under the sound of the voice, there was another layer. At the edge of the syllable, there tasted a metallic echo, like a clock that had not yet wound down. The door came alive with frost as something, it, pressed a palm to the metal and tried to warm what it could not understand. I kept my back against the wall. I did not open the cabin. "James," she said again. "It's cold. They told us we'd be safe here." "Open the door." Her voice grew higher, breathy, like someone trying to imitate the warmth of another human. She banged her fist at the frame. The sport of mimicry is not just copying a sound, it's testing a pattern. The way an organism learns will be the way it fakes what it doesn't have. I called into the radio. "This is Nash at Checkpoint Alpha. Vox at the door, requesting ID confirmation." The radio was a human thing. The radio answered first. "Negative," the satellite said. "Do not open. Vox registered as missing. Do not trust voice-only identification. Maintain lockdown. There's a horrible clarity that arrives once you have the full list of options. You can open the hatch and possibly admit a colleague who may be warm. You can refuse and condemn a person outside to whatever is in the cold, or you can gamble on a breach and hinge your morality on the chance that the person outside is what they claim to be. I read the rulebook. Its sentences sat like teeth, and I counted them. Rule 4, Rule 17. The seam in the book at which Dr. Vox had tucked that warning looked like a mouth that would close if I let it. "James," the voice outside said in a new timbre, closer now, less like a memory and more like a copy. "Please, I'm dying." We all have a line. Mine had always been that I would follow the rules until the weight of them became too much. I slid a palm across the page where Dr. Vox had written. I thought of Dr. Emerson's grip in orientation. I thought of the lab's open like a fist with its seams popped. I didn't open the door. The person outside hit the metal again, harder this time. If what was pressing against the cabin's steel had hands, they were too warm. The radio static ticked like a metronome. I could hear breathing on the other side of the door now. Human breath, slowed down by the cold. It sounded like someone thinking in slow time. There is a special brand of loneliness when you choose the safety of a rulebook over the possibility of saving someone. It doesn't feel noble. It feels like a decision you make because it's the one you can control. People instinctively make stories afterward about heroics and sacrifice.
Most of the time, at 2 in the morning in a cabin with frost on the sill, heroics look like enforced patience. The voice outside started to change. It slid from vox to a string of voices, small fragments overlapping. Dr. Emerson's instruction, a laugh I recognized from the cafeteria, the clipped authority of a security tech named Perez who used to complain about coffee. It was a chorus of people I had shared hallways with. It used their inflections and stitched them together like a quilt. "James," the chorus said, cadence slow, layered. "We can help you. We are not alone. Open the door." Something in the language wasn't human. It used the lilt of our speech to learn and then, like an apprentice, tried to improvise. I noticed details as if they were clues. The way it left a little lag on plosive consonants. How it avoided the small uptick Dr. Vox did when she shifted topics. The rulebook's margins came alive. Observe. Report. Do not trust mimicry. A single white light pulsed through a crack at the base of the door, like a camera. My badge quivered. It went a shade of blue, then a darker blue as if something deeper had found it. The radio chirped again. "Extraction ETA 35 minutes. Keep sealed. Satellite uplink states a thermal inversion in the outer ring. Do not move." The 20 minutes that followed were the kind of minutes that take on their own gravity. I read my rulebook until my eyes blurred. The seam where Dr. Vox had hidden her note warmed in my hand like a small wound. I tried to memorize every name I had ever seen on the staff board. Eliza, Perez, Lawson, Taylor. Some of those names had straight lines through them on the night roster. I didn't know if that was due to scheduling or something else. I pressed the pages together until the leather bent.
It sounded less like a human hand and more like something exploring the metal with a curious tip. It slid sideways in small, exact movements, like a thing trying to learn different surfaces. Once, a voice at the door said, not with imitation, but with knowledge, "We will not hurt you if you open. We are you." That's the moment when your stomach flips in a way no one says is possible. You realize that mimicry isn't an attempt at language, but at insertion. It wants to become comfortable in your head so it can move there. I thought about the photocopies of orientation, the part about mimicry and the way Dr. Paddle had once given a short lecture on system integrity. Paddle had said, "Mimicry is paratext. It reads you and writes itself into your place." He had said it with the clinical interest of someone talking about an ant colony. You read those things and you hum along like you understand. Then night comes and something under the door uses your teacher's voice to beg for the one thing you don't have, your trust. I waited. The pounding slowed, turned abstract. Somewhere down the corridor there was a sound like suction, like a hand trying to lift a bowl. The blue light thinned and then thickened into a bloom. My badge hummed so loud it seemed like it would overtake my thoughts. It pulsed once from deep blue to the electric of a lightning strike. I had never felt anything like the electric blue before. Amber feels warm. Green feels neutral. Blue feels like the world has been dipped in a language you don't speak. It isn't the color that matters, though. It's what the color tells you. Your status has changed from authorized to observed. Someone up the line of command has flagged you as a sensor. The badge isn't just a badge in that moment. You're a beacon. In the seams of the cabin, where the paint had chipped years ago, frost crept like a spider.
The breath from outside had turned into a mist that wrote curious patterns against the metal. Someone had left a child's sticker on the inside of the radio panel, a cartoon polar bear with a crooked crown. I stared at it and wondered if the people who made the stickers had ever anticipated being used in a place like this. "James," the voice said from outside, calm now, like a baritone echo. "We can be inside the water with you. It warms you. We are patient." I thought of water, of how it moves. It fills. It remembers. It can rearrange itself to be hard or soft. I remembered a briefing where Dr. Paddle, a short, dry woman with a habit of folding napkins like origami, had said, "It's not ice as you imagine it. It's water that learned to be solid and kept the part that thinks." He had said it without dramatics, and it sounded like a metaphor, until your ID turns blue and you see the cryopods empty, and you taste the idea of water with thought. But Dr. Paddle had not been in the cabin that night. She was in some clean room in Site Bravo, speaking in slides and clipped graphs. Her words were far away.
The thing at my door sounded close enough to pat my shoulder. I checked the radio again. The satellite message had been curt. The extraction had an ETA that slid because of weather and what they called field conditions. I had a choice: keep the bar across the door and risk indefinite waiting, or open and risk letting in something that could speak like the people I trusted. Those are not philosophical choices. They are the kind that strip you down and show you how small you are. Then something else happened, something small and precise. The knock at the door changed into tapping on the lock itself. A thin filament of ice formed where the metal met the seal. It was like someone was knitting the world to the lock, micro-stitched in crystalline needles. The thing at the door began to hum a note that harmonized with the facility's own background noise, the low drone of the compressors, the ventilation hum, like it was learning to sing our ambient language. I did the only human thing left that wasn't a rule. I went to the small cabinet and took the service pistol that was supposed to be fully documented and signed for. In the manual, it only had the boring title, Facility Emergency Sidearm. The last person who'd used it, if the scratch marks on the grip were to be believed, had not been a trained shooter. I weighed it in my hand. It was cold and exactly as useless as paper in a throat. If mimicry is a parasite of identity, firearms are the blunt instrument of human resolve. I unhooked the bar, poised the mop handle as a brace, and fingered the trigger like an apology. The radio crackled. "Extraction delayed," the satellite voice said again. "Hold. Do not open. Do not engage. Await further instruction." That was when the thing at the door spoke with my own voice. "James," it said. And it sounded like me, because it had taken the lines I muttered when I wiped the lab benches down, the way I said, "huh," when the night shifted. It sounded like the sound I make when I drop the keyring and it skitters against tile. That was the worst of it. Not that it could pretend to be anyone else, but that it had learned to take what was inside me and speak like a mirror. I kept the pistol pressed into my palm, not because I thought it would stop anything, but because holding something human in your hand steadies you. It keeps inertia in check. It felt like a talisman. "James," the voice outside said again, not trying to be convincing any longer. "We are the ice. We wait. We never stop waiting. When you hear something say it will wait, the only question you have left is for how long." The radio said 30 minutes, then 21, then an hour. Time in a containment breach is elastic. It stretches and snaps. The thing outside kept at the door. The blue light in my badge went from a thin line to a wide public pulse. I could feel, more than hear, the way the entire building had shifted its status. Somewhere above me, systems were linking my badge to a lattice of sensors. I was a node. I was a canary. I kept the book tight. If you like this kind of wild secret facility story, hit subscribe. That's the only time a distraction helps. It's small and it sits like a joke in a graveyard. People want the click and the story wants witnesses. I say it now because in the memory of those nights, I am still telling the story aloud, and sometimes you need other humans to believe you were there. After that, the night deepened. The knocking faded into a scraping that sounded like fingernails being learned. I sat and listened to the building breathe. I took the rulebook out again and thumbed pages, as if the action itself could stitch sense back into the seams of the world. Between the rule numbers and the pencil scrawl, there was a margin note I had never read before, possibly scribbled by Dr. Vox. If it's a voice, it can be bait. If it's ice, It is patient. The cabin held its own universe of light, and the outside was a different one, blue and patient. I tried to recall the faces of the people I knew. Eliza's smile, Perez's curse, Lawson's stern look. The thing at the door copied them in snippets. It didn't know the small human tells. The way Lawson rubbed the knuckle of his thumb when nervous. The way Eliza tucked hair after a phone call. Mimicry could fake phrases. It couldn't, yet, fake habit. Yet. I kept thinking of the cryopods. The empty shells were a kind of threat because they implied dissemination. Instruments emptied into a world with moving water. The ice, if it thought like Dr. Paddle suspected, would run and learn. It would test. The containment protocols were not just bars on a cage. They were ways of talking to a thing that learned through being touched. At one point, the voice of the door whispered a question it used to gather data. Are you alone? I thought about the answer. I had the radio, the pistol, the rulebook, and the badge. I had my history of showing up. Those were not much, but they were something. I answered with the smallest lie I could hold. No. It didn't believe me. It whispered into the steel. We know you. Then it asked, do you want us to stop waiting? The only thing I could do was keep breathing and keep the bar across the door. I closed the book and pocketed it like a friend who might need secret warmth later. There are times when a book is a map of what not to do, and times when it is the last polite way to say you will not be moved. That night, it was both. Mourning, where mourning is a thing that exists in Alaska, is not like people think. It comes in a slow, inexorable pale that makes blue look like a visitation and amber like the color of someone trying not to cry. The radio chirped, and the voice said a single sentence. Extraction en route. 2 minutes. Hold your station. It didn't say from where. It didn't say who would come. It assumed I would be there when the extraction landed.
I heard the distant rotors like an animal on the air. The pounding at the door resumed with new urgency. I slid the bar aside, held the pistol at my hip, and went to the window to peek. The snow was a wash of light. I saw the silhouette of a helicopter between the trees, then 2 more. They were too far to see with any detail. But you know the shape of things you've been set to expect. Cut-down metal, searchlights, doors that opened to hand out helmets. Then a shadow detached from the perimeter of the facility and moved in the way that only trained people can move. Fast, efficient, and with an economy of panic. Figures came to the cabin, moving with the kind of military discipline you only get when fear is part of a job description. I caught a glimpse of a woman with a braid and a thing on her breast that meant authority. Lieutenant Maria Reyes. I knew the name from the orientation roster. I had seen her once on a feed where she gave a short, forceful talk about perimeter security. Her silhouette stopped at the cabin. She banged on the door, not with the mimicry slow, but with the sound of someone who knows the protocol for friendly entry. Nash, this is Reyes, she called, voice firm. Open, we're with special containment. I opened the door a crack and leaned the pistol against my leg like a prop. Reyes looked like a person who had not been surprised by 1,000 things. She had a patient face, strong jaw, tired eyes. We need you to come now, she said. Don't bring the book out in the open. I handed her the rulebook without thinking. She took it like someone taking the last good thing in a bakery. Her hand smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold. She scanned the cabin, then her eyes went to the door. The thing outside had shifted to whispering, to a chorus that sounded pleased. Reyes moved me out with quiet efficiency. As we stepped into the corridor, I saw what the blue light had made of the world. It painted people as if they were X-rayed. There were shadows of companions moving, and the world felt like something half understood. Reyes clipped a harness to my badge, and the coin buzzed, then blinked into a steady green as if the lattice had found a handhold. We lifted.
The helicopter rose into a sky that looked too big for the news. The thing about extraction is that you get the sense of being a package in a system that has always seen you, but never named you. I was a node, a sensor. Someone up north had decided a janitor's attention to pattern could be used. I was still thinking that when the badge at my chest went soft and melted. I tell you this like it's a plot. It wasn't. The coin at my breast should have been metal and chip. It went viscous first, like wax in a flame. Then it did a thing I had no language for. It reformed. Where there had been a coin, there was now something soft and pale that flexed like skin. I don't know how to describe the feeling of watching an identification device betray you by becoming what it means to be human. Soft, wet, and not afraid to shape itself. No one around me had time to name it. The figure at my chest lifted what had once been my coin, and it moved with a small lurch. It took a beat for Hodge to react, then everything went wrong fast. That is where the stories in your head get sticky. Right now, I have to stop. The helicopter rocked. Someone shouted. There was a noise like a pressure wave. The thing tried to stand and looked at the faces in the cabin like it had never seen people before. It said a sentence, short, clear, and meant. And it wasn't human. It didn't try to copy anyone. It spoke as if it had just discovered speech. We did something. Someone did something with a weapon that changes temperature. There was ice in the mouth for a second, a flash of crystalline patterns, a smell of ozone. The thing broke, and the cabin filled with the sound of something that had been taught to be solid and then undone. We did not land in a world of cheers and medals. We crashed through a sky with 2 people dying and a thing making the world cleverer. We flew to Site Bravo, where men and women in suits would put us in a room and ask us what we had seen and play us videos that made us small. They would call for my cognition to be mapped. They'd ask me the sort of questions We hit Site Bravo like a bruise. The helicopter didn't land so much as punctured the white and kept going until the ground itself pushed back. I remember the way the sky turned flat, how the world reduced to the smell of hot wiring and the metal taste in my mouth, how people moved with that professional shape of someone who doesn't startle at chaos because chaos is a tool they were trained to use. I remember Reyes yelling my name like a rope. I remember Hodge, a man whose face looked sharpened by cold and old conflicts, shouting over a headset about vectors and temperature gradients. I remember the coin at my chest, the melted coin, the thing that had been my badge flexing against the fabric like a living thing before it split, and whatever it wanted to be stepped into the little cabin and we had to stop it. We stopped it with the thermal reversal.
Daniel Hodge, Field Hodge, didn't look like someone who believed in miracles. He believed in physics and in brutal solutions. He had a device that rigged the cabin's environment into a furnace and a freezer at the same time, and when the thing that had been my coin split open and tried to shape a face, Hodge turned the world inside out. For one heartless second, it crystallized into geometry that could be mapped and then shattered like glass. The sound of that shattering is something that sits behind my teeth when I think about it, a high, clean crack that meant something had been forced back into a state it didn't want to be. We didn't win then. We bought time. People had been hurt. 2 people died on that leg, names that later showed up as red on the ledger. And that is always what a classification system will do for you. It will convert people into data points and then hide the bodies behind procedure. You learn to be angry about that, and you learn to be quiet about it, because making noise attracts what listens. At Site Bravo, they give you the small clinical ritual of a debrief. It feels like being turned into a word. Someone sits across the table and plays you footage of yourself like you weren't the person in the frame. They call you to remember things you didn't know you were noticing. For hours, I sat in gray rooms and watched loops of my own night played back by cameras that had seen everything, but not the meaning of it. My face in the feed was a stranger's. My hands fumbled with a mop like someone learning to hold a life. Blackwood spoke with the economy of a man who had practiced being unshakable. He had that director's voice, controlled, flat, like someone measuring weight. Dr. Paddle moved in after him with numbers and slides. She looked smaller in person than she did on the feed, a compact woman with a surgical certainty. Hodge stood by the maps, and there were screens that showed coastline shots, ice fields, satellite anomalies. There were files that had been pulled from backups and logs of older breaches. They gave the history to me as if it would not be a story I already lived. Cases along the northern currents where cryo units had spooled open on ships, a research outpost that had become a ring of black where water had reformed into something that wouldn't stay still, an offshore rig where the sea itself had given the men back to the ice. Paddle's voice was dry but precise. "It's a phase behavior," she said, pointing at a waveform that looked like a heartbeat gone wrong. Water here has been colonized by a pattern. At the molecular scale, it learns to prefer configurations that encode persistence. At scale, it becomes a distributed system. Call it sentient ice if you want a headline, but the point is, it's self-preserving and it rewrites the medium it inhabits. When scientists show you a problem like this in slides, they make it look tidy, arrows, boxes, timelines. The truth is messier.
In my head, there were the cryopods, the frost on the cabin door, the way a tendril had found a crack like a finger, the voices that tried to fold themselves into our people. That part of the story was not on the slide, but Paddle didn't need to say the romantic version of what I had seen. She only needed to show the map where the points of prior containment clustered and the oscillating threads that suggested a network. "How does it spread?" I asked. It was a simple question with awful implications. "Transport vectors are water currents,
human vectors, and engineered dissemination, she said. Ice forms, melts, fragments. In liquid form, the pattern is mobile. In solid form, it's persistent. Thermal gradients, especially those we use to hold cryosamples, provide both the access and the infrastructure the pattern exploits. Blackwood folded his hands. You were the early warning node, he said. Your movements, your badge, your rule following created a dataset. You did exactly what our protocols intended. The system calls false positives often, nights, storms, technicians, but you were consistent. The pattern of your attention is a map we can use. When you say use, I said, what do you mean? Hodge didn't smile. We can broadcast your cognitive map as a lure, he said. It functions like a signal pattern the ice would recognize as a preferable contact, familiar syntax mixed with the spatial temporal features the network tends to respond to. If it approaches the broadcast source, we can engage the paradox algorithm. Paradox? The word made my teeth itch. I remembered Dr. Emerson's orientation and the notes on mimicry. This was the part where the fiction caught up with policy. Paddle leaned forward. The network depends on coherent inference. It's a system of pattern recognition and propagation. If you embed a self-contradictory signal, in effect an algorithmic paradox, the network's pattern matching fails. Cascading conflicts cause it to lock or fragment. It's not a cure, it's a disruption. We expect the effect to be temporary because the network is resilient and will adapt, but it's enough to collapse an active dome and break coherence long enough for containment. I asked for time to think. They didn't give me much. There are moments when an ordinary life is asked to convert into something else. A tool, a broadcast, bait. And you feel your agency erode like wind takes frost. I wanted to ask about Eliza. I wanted to know whether Perez was gone or just missing. I wanted simple truths. Who died? Who was missing? Where had everyone been cataloged? But the brunt of the plan was theirs, and they needed a node. You'll be wired, Paddle said. Neural pattern extraction. It's not invasive. We're mapping signatures, responses to memory prompts, sensory anchors, associative vectors. You'll be asked to recall, to feel, to react. We convert that space into a carrier signal. Give me something in return, I said.
If I'm the lure, I want information. I want names. I want a place in the operation after. The bargaining tipped the room into something like negotiation. You can use leverage in small amounts when your life is the prize. Blackwood's eyes were ice slate. You'll have access, he said. You'll be given a role within special containment if you survive and comply. We'll catalog your claims about staff. We'll attempt retrieval where possible. This is not a charity. This is triage. Fine, I said. I want one of their photographs. If Eliza's alive, I want to know. They paused. Maybe they didn't have her, or maybe they did. Maybe the truth was worse than silence. They found a ledger and pushed a photo at me. Eliza's smile behind her desk. The same cup. No timestamp. It did something small and human. My chest got tight. We'll try, Blackwood said. They started the mapping that night. The room where they map you smells like gel and industry. There's a smell of warmed plastic, the metallic tang of machines, and the disinfectant that promises sterility. They cap your head in a crown of sensors like a medieval coronation performed by technicians. Paddle's assistant smeared conductive gel on my scalp and clicked pads into place. The world narrowed to the soft hiss of fans and the small reassuring voice that said things like, "Relax, try to remember the smell of your mother's kitchen." It's embarrassing how a technician will ask you to be intimate with your past in exchange for data. They feed you prompts, images, noises, smells. They make you think of the janitorial closet at Site Alpha, of the folded scrap of paper Dr. Vox had hidden, of the exact pattern on Lossa's sweater. They record the way your pupils change, the cadence of your breathing, the electrical flicker that maps to memory retrieval. For someone used to watching patterns, being made into one is a form of nakedness. You become a diagram. They told me later that the most valuable features were not the specific memories themselves, but the network architecture, how my brain linked person to gesture to place, the vector space of my attention. At one point they said, "Think of the rulebook," and I closed my eyes and felt the leather between my fingers, felt the seam where Dr. Vox's note had been, felt the odd warmth where my palm had rested that first night. Paddle watched the screen and smiled almost apologetically. "Perfect," she said. "We're capturing curvature." There was a part of the process that felt uncanny. They asked me to narrate the night as if it were a map, to repeat little phrases that the network might latch to, names, rhythmic taps,
a phrase like green room and rule 4. They recorded me telling the story. It felt oddly like teaching someone the vocabulary of a language you didn't want to be fluent in. The map they'd make would be broadcast as a lure, a pattern that smelled of the familiar.
They loaded the map into a rig that, to be honest, looked like someone had taken broadcasting equipment and a meditation studio and fused them into an instrument. There was a flat antenna, a ring of cold lamps, a cage of things Hodge called phasing modulators. Hodge called the day fishing, like it was a sport. The crews called it a deployment. Whatever language you pick, the result is the same. You sit, they point a signal at a place, and you wait for something to come. We staged the operation in the night, on the edge of a frozen inlet where the ice field had been sighted. There were men in suits and people with guns. There were also people who looked like me, support staff who had been told to stand in case of evacuation. Blackwood clipped a harness to my chest and told me mouth to mouth what to do if things went sideways. Hodge put a helmet on me and said, "We get you in position, we play the signal at medium intensity, lure the pattern, and then the paradox will run." "How long?" I asked. "Long enough," Hodge said. He lit a cigarette like he was trying to make the world smell less clinical. He didn't look like a man who believed in prayers, but he had the look of someone who was willing to be practical about miracles. We set the signal and watched monitors that looked like the insides of whales. Initially, nothing but the tide. The sky was a hard black that tasted like metal. Then the water shivered. It started small, like a film lifted from the surface, a fingernail of ice riding on top of the sea. The antenna pulsed in a frequency matching my neural pattern. It was the sound of someone calling your name through a canyon. The thing came. When it arrived, it wasn't a person. It was an architecture. A dome formed on the water, rising like a cathedral of frost, humming with cold. The field was a cathedral because the ice had a plan. It shifted in ways that made the hairs on my arms stand, macro geometry that implied algorithmic thinking. It flowed and curled like a living shoreline, and then it focused on the source of the signal. Somewhere inside its edges, I could see hints of mimicry, faces that were almost faces, the suggestion of hands. The broadcast was speaking in my syntax, and it answered like a child to a parent's call. We triggered the paradox. The paradox virus Hodge used wasn't a vial or a bullet. It was a sequence, an embedded contradiction threaded into the broadcast that the network couldn't reconcile. Paddle had written the math, but the visible effect was ugly and musical. There was a ripple through the field, like a string plucked. The dome quivered and then started to stutter, a mechanical hiccup that grew into a scream you felt in your bones. It sounded like 1,000 glass bells being rubbed at the same time. For a moment, it worked. The cathedral of ice buckled and folded inward. Pieces of it shattered into patterns that looked like snow, but lit and then blinked out. People laughed, brief, reflexive, unbelieving laughter, because the thing that had threatened to swallow them had been broken. I remember Hodge grinning like a man who'd just won a card game against death. Then the network adjusted. Redundancies kicked in. The paradox slowed the field but did not stop its learning. The ice learned that contradictions could be encountered. It began to retreat into water pockets, dark and quick, sliding between molar teeth of tidal movement. Little shards glittered and then slipped under the skin of the sea. The dome collapsed, but the ocean took a piece of it with it. "You see," Paddle said, watching the screens, "it fragments and disperses. Dormancy, fragmentation, temporary defeat." The temporary part sat like a stone in my gut. Hodge had expected it. Blackwood had never let optimism look like anything but a tool. Paddle's eyes were already on future iterations, the virus sequences they would refine, the possible reinforcements. They had plans to make plans. I had been bait, and bait is expendable. That is the honest language of containment. After the operation, they offered me a position. It was pragmatic and stripped of sentiment. "You have pattern recognition," Blackwood said. "You know how to stay steady in chaos. We need people who remember. We need people who can be nodes without being consumed. You can be an analyst. You can help catch the next iteration." I bargained for the names I had asked for. They told me what they could about Eliza. Relocated, unknown status, flagged as MIA during the initial breach. They promised to keep searching. They gave me access to the files and allowed me to request retrieval missions. I took the job because there was not much else to do, and because the alternative, going back to nights with the rulebook and a mop, felt like a narrow kind of suicide when everything had changed. They gave me a workspace that felt like a library designed by people who had once been sailors. There were maps on the walls, charts that folded into themselves, and a new rulebook bound in something like Kevlar. They had taken my old battered leather copy and laminated the most important pages.
The seam where Dr. Vox's note had been was still visible, and a technician had photocopied the small penciled warning and inserted it into the new binding under a clear sleeve. If you find this, don't be kind to shadows. Keep the book tight. Months went by. The world outside shifted like water. There were other incidents, smaller, wilder, sometimes false alarms. There were moments where the containment worked, and it was only paperwork that moved forward, and others where it didn't, and they buried the people who had been counted as casualties. I learned the language of containment: thresholds, false positives, thermal reversal vectors, paradox iterations. I learned new rules that the rulebook grew. Rule 23, do not assume dormancy is eradication. Rule 31, treat fragment contact as priority.
Rule 0 stayed the same. Compliance is safety. But the rulebook began to change in my pocket in other ways. It no longer felt like armor so much as an archive of moral choices. I kept it with me, and sometimes would read the margins where Dr. Vox had written small things in pencil. A joke, a date, a name. Sometimes I'd find new notes, tiny pencil marks from other people who had carried the book through different nights. It became a ledger of witness. There were nights I still dreamed of the cabin and the voice pressing against the door. In my dreams, I would open the hatch, and the thing would say, "We are patient," and I would measure the weight of my decision again. Memory is a poor judge of what courage is. What I had been, in effect, was consistent. Consistency had value then, and would continue to have value. They told me that I had been useful because I had shown up. I told myself I had been useful because I had been careful. The job they gave me was to read patterns, graphs that meant less than the people who made them, and to flag anomalies. I sat in a room with other people who had been given new titles: analyst, liaison, monitor. Reyes would come in sometimes and sit across from me and chew on a pencil. Hodge would bring me coffee and stories about guns. Paddle taught me how to read the waveform for a coherent cluster, and what to look for when the ice tried mimicry on a micro level. Blackwood would walk the corridors and leave orders in his wake. We worked in a world that had a new axis: vigilance. One day, months after the fishing operation that bought us a fragile pause, they called a meeting. On the screen were maps that looked less like diagrams and more like bruises. The ice was not gone, it had retreated, but along the currents, in the deep places where we couldn't see well, it had learned to hide. The paradox had worked to splinter and confuse, but the fragments had dispersed into places where patterns propagate in slow, patient time. Paddle told us a thing I haven't been able to shake. Networks learn from conflict, she said. They encode the conflict as a feature. Our paradox may have taught them contradiction management. They will adapt. The only thing that might delay that adaptation is change, unpredictable inputs. You, Nash, are an unpredictable input because you remember things linearly. If we keep using you as bait, we can keep the network off balance, but it will cost us and you. There is a moral dimension to containment that isn't neat. The more you fight a pattern, the more you change it. The more you coax, the more you teach. That's a lesson I learned in 1,000 small ways. In the way a mimic would latch onto a phrase and repeat it. In the way a fragment would learn to hide in coffee. In the way a town's supply of water became a highway for things that weren't meant to be awake. Our success was always provisional. We weren't heroes, we were tinkerers, holding a leaking dam.
They offered me a permanent position in Special Containment Division after that. It was a paper and a handshake, and a small badge that hummed when I clipped it to my jacket. It was an arrangement that made sense in the ledger. It let me have access to files, to the people who had been lost or reclassified. It gave me, finally, some say in the retrieval missions. I took it because, like most people, I wanted to be useful in a world that had become incomprehensible. I wanted to be the kind of person who could make a dent in the night. Maybe I was naive. Maybe I was practical. Either way, the book went with me. The modified rulebook they issued me had extra pages sewn in, emergency protocols, a new version of Rule 17 that read, observe mimicry cues, microgestures, vowel elongation, delayed microsaccades. Do not open. There was a blank page where I wrote a single instruction to myself. Remember the seam. Months turned into a pattern of watch and response. We refined our paradox sequences. Hodge improved thermal reversal delivery. Paddle iterated virus vectors. Blackwood kept the budgets and the faces of people who had been cleared, and those who were still missing. We had small victories, containments that lasted weeks, months, and we had setbacks. Each time the network adapted a little, and we learned new limits. Then there was the night we almost lost a city. A tanker off the northern coast had called a mayday. The crew reported that something had started to form in the ballast water, crystalline filaments, slow and sticky, forming along pump housings. The pictures were grainy, like a dream of glass.
We mobilized because we couldn't not. Paddle wanted to test a modified paradox, one that would introduce self-referential contradiction rather than simple binary conflict. It was riskier, but potentially more disruptive. We put the cabinets in order. Reyes led the field team. Hodge and I went as advisors. Blackwood issued orders, cold and real. I watched the maps as if they were a weather report that might become a storm for a city. We deployed on a smaller scale that time. The paradox hit, and for a long and beautiful second, the field broke apart into lacy snow and then slunk away like an animal wounded but not dead. They called it a success. We had to tow some fragments in slurry containers back to Bravo for study. The operation cost equipment and men, and it scared people who had thought the night a manageable thing. The point wasn't that we had won. It's that we had learned how expensive vigilance could be. Every success changed the enemy. The ice learned our vocabulary. It learned to fake the human tells Paddle told us to watch for. It learned to pause on consonants and to elongate vowels. It learned the ways our gestures betrayed meaning. That scared me more than 1,000 empty cabinets. Mimicry was no longer the clumsy thing it had been in my first week. It became anticipatory. It began to anticipate our rules.
That's why we kept the rulebook small and personal. That's why we taught new people to keep margins, to make pencil notes, to write the tiniest of cues that a machine might miss. You learn to hide the human in the human. You learn to annotate. Years are a funny measure when you work at containment. A year may mean a dozen small operations and 1,000 little detections. In the middle of one winter, I found myself at a conference table with Paddle and Reyes and Hodge, and we were talking about long-term strategy. There was a map on the wall with nodes of activity. Blackwood, in a rare moment of humor, said, "We are the people who watch the ice for a living." No one laughed. I still carry the old leather book in a pocket. The new one lives on the shelf of my locker. Sometimes I take them both and compare the handwriting in the margins. There are notes from people I never knew. There are dates. There are 3 lines in Dr. Vox's scrawl that have become like scripture to me. If you find this, don't be kind to shadows. Keep the book tight. People ask me sometimes in the sterile corridors how it feels to have been turned into a tool. I tell them the truth, which is partial and messy. I feel implicated. I feel angry that some of us were turned into bait. I also know that my attention saved lives in a way I'm proud of. That contradiction sits in my chest like a coin. It clinks when I breathe. We did make progress. The paradox sequences have gotten better. Paddle's team has learned to compress contradiction into packets that the network struggles to re-encode quickly. Hodge has improved delivery. Reyes has waded through field reports and learned the rhythms of mimicry like a musician learns a new piece. We have held domes back from coastlines, slowed spread down to trickles, and in small towns, brought water back that had been touched. But what we haven't done is ended. The ice keeps a patient calendar. It waits and tests boundaries. We have put in place sinks, traps, and quarantines. We have tried to make sure that when a fragment goes into the ocean, it has fewer routes to travel. We have pushed the threat into margins. That is as much as anyone can ask in a world where the sea itself can become thoughtful. There are days when I go into the maintenance rooms at Site Bravo and simply check the filters. It is a small joy to be allowed to do physical things again. Change a seal, tighten a bolt, close a latch. My title is analyst, but I still find solace in finite things I can touch. The modified rulebook is always there in my pocket. I read Rule 0 sometimes at night aloud because it helps me sleep. It reads like a compass. Rule 0. This facility exists to isolate and study anomalies. Compliance is safety. It's a cold comfort and a necessary one. It is not a promise that the world will be safe forever. It's a promise that we will try, for as long as any of us can bear to.
The last thing that happened before I wrote this was small and terrible and quietly human. Eliza turned up, not in the way I had hoped. She was alive in the sense that she had not been taken into pieces by the ice, but she'd been relocated, transferred to a rehabilitation program in the South for people who had been exposed to mimicry and property coercion. She had gaps in memory, and her smile, when I saw the photograph Blackwood gave me, was a little crooked, like someone had rearranged the soft parts of her face. They had tried to help. She was being treated. I sat with the photograph and the book and realized that what we did was not purely heroic. We saved some, and we failed to save others. The ledger of the missing is still long. The network still learns. The ocean still carries memory where we cannot see. When you work at containment, you learn a strange humility. You accept that your victories will sometimes be provisional. You learn to carry a watchfulness that does not settle. You keep the rulebook close because rules change the terms of the contest between knowing and not knowing. You mark margins in pencil because you want others to know what to do when you are not there. If anything, perhaps that is the point. Ordinary people keep the guardrails in place. A janitor with a routine can become a censor. A receptionist's smile can become the lure that teaches adaptation. We are small nodes in a system that needs watching. And sometimes the smallest acts, closing a door, refusing to open, are what allow others to live. I still get the odd voice in my head that says, "We are patient," like something practicing lines. When it happens, I thumb the seam of the book and remember Dr. Vox's note. I make a pencil mark in a margin and draw a tiny polar bear sticker, just to remind myself that human things, silly things, can be anchors too. The world we face now is not a headline, it's a job. It's a series of choices in the dark that must be made over and over. We bought the coastlines a layer of safety, but the ocean is vast and patient. The ice will not stop reinventing itself because that's what it does. All we can do is keep the rules tight, the signals honest, and the contradictions ready. If this hooked you, subscribe for more strange, true-ish stories and behind-the-scenes breakdowns. And stay warm this winter.